The first thing we have to state is that essentially all people come into this world to serve God, that every soul has a mission. The general mission of every Jewish soul is to learn the Torah, keep the mitzvot of the Torah, and in that respect, there is absolutely no difference between males and females. If we're going to do this legally, then we could say that women are exempt of time from fulfilling time-bound positive commandments, although there are more exceptions than there are mitzvot that fall under this rule. So we have to speak about why this is, what could be the possible reasons. One other thing that I think we need to note is that when people think in their minds about the huge difference between males and females in traditional Judaism, they're primarily thinking about what happens in the synagogue. And just as Judaism is not a church-based religion, it's not a mosque-based religion, it's definitely not a synagogue-based religion. And that's lost on many people, tragically, because most of their Judaic experience is in the synagogue. And if they come to a traditional synagogue, they could be forgiven for thinking that Judaism for a woman is a spectator sport. But if you actually look at Jewish observance, even for the man who's going to shul 3 times a day and is studying Torah in some institution, let's say twice a day, still I would postulate that 97% of the religious observance is actually happening in the home. And having said that, and established that truth about Judaism actually puts a lot of things into perspective. So now going back to this Mishnaic ruling that women are exempt from time-bound positive mitzvot, we ask why. The reason that's most oft advanced is that a woman has an overarching obligation to her home. Since mitzvot are obligations, not hobbies, since we have the 10 commandments, not the 10 suggestions, you can't obligate one person in 2 directions at the same time. And to appreciate this, we have to appreciate that the home is the single most important institution that Jews have. We don't have a future without a home. We could live without synagogues and federations and Jewish centers, and even without the mikveh, because we have oceans and seas. But if we don't have strong Jewish homes, we have nothing. So if we're going to posit that as the central institution of Jewish life, then we have to say that there has to be a system that protects and nourishes and strengthens that. And to be sure, both parents, both principal parties in a marriage are responsible for strengthening the home. But the Jewish woman has been given the overarching responsibility in that direction. Now, homemaking is not to be confused with housekeeping. So we're not talking about who cooks. We're not talking about a fair division of labor in that sense. We're talking about who sets the tone. And that takes both conceptual and practical form. So practically speaking, if this is where a woman puts much of her effort, even if it's not most, but certainly much of her effort, you can't ask her to divide herself in half. But it's never seemed to me that that's the only reason. So I think that there are 2 other things at work. One has to be the idea of modesty. And that, I think, has a strong bearing on male and female roles, with the female role being more modest. That in and of itself is a complex thing to speak about today as the role of women becomes more public. That's an interesting discussion to have. But certainly, as public as it is, it's always with a more inward or modest sensibility. And finally, we have to come back to something that is absolutely essential, and that is understanding that males and females are different in every way, including spiritually. And just as, for instance, a woman, the Talmud says, is not circumcised because she's born circumcised. So there's a redundancy there. And just as a man doesn't have to put on tefillin on Shabbos because he already has 2 other signs that remind him of his covenant, Shabbos being one of them, So he doesn't need tefillin on Saturday. So once it becomes redundant, it becomes prohibited. So there are certain things that women don't do in terms of ritual obligation because it's spiritually unnecessary or redundant. This does not make them more holy. This does not make them greater than men. It makes them spiritually distinct. You might say it makes them spiritually more porous, more open in some way to connection with God. Certainly the idea of circumcision is the taking away, is the tearing away of some type of spiritual impediment or obstruction. And a woman simply doesn't have that obstruction in the first place. So when we talk about certain things that a woman's exempt from, I think spiritually we're saying it's not something she has to do to effect a certain connection to God that a male might have to do to effect that connection.
If you like that video, hit the subscribe button and notification bell below for hours of the best Jewish content online.